The courtroom camera captured a moment that would make millions of people's blood boil. Karen Westbrook, a wealthy landlord dripping in designer clothes and expensive jewelry, actually laughed out loud as a homeless mother clutched her sick 7-year-old daughter and described sleeping in a car for 6 weeks. The laugh wasn't quiet or subtle. It echoed through Judge Judy's courtroom like nails on a chalkboard, and what happened in the next 3 minutes would become the most satisfying moment of justice ever captured on daytime television. Judge Judy's response was so brutal, so legally devastating, that Karen went from smirking confidence to desperate sobbing faster than anyone thought possible. This case exploded across social media with over 42 million views, and once you see what Judge Judy did to this entitled landlord, you'll understand exactly why the entire internet couldn't stop watching. Before we dive into the complete destruction of the most heartless Karen ever to enter a courtroom, make sure you hit that like button right now because what you're about to witness will restore your faith that bullies don't always win. Subscribe and turn on notifications because we're bringing you the most explosive courtroom moments where entitled people finally face the consequences they've been avoiding their whole lives. Trust me, when you see Judge Judy reveal the evidence that destroyed Karen's entire property empire, you'll want to share this with everyone you know. Karen Westbrook walked into that courtroom on a Tuesday morning thinking this would be just another easy victory. She was a 48-year-old property owner with 12 rental units across suburban Connecticut, and she had spent years perfecting the art of exploiting vulnerable tenants. Her strategy was simple and cruel. Target single mothers, immigrants, and people with bad credit who couldn't afford lawyers. Use aggressive tactics to force them out before they could fight back legally. Keep their security deposits by inventing fake damage charges. Over 5 years, she had illegally evicted 23 families and stolen tens of thousands of dollars in deposits that legally belonged to people who were already struggling. She viewed herself as a businesswoman making smart decisions, but everyone else saw her for what she really was. A predator who weaponized wealth against people in crisis. Sitting across from Karen in the plaintiff's chair was Jennifer Williams, a 34-year-old certified nursing assistant whose entire world had collapsed in the span of 8 weeks. Jennifer had always been the responsible type. She worked double shifts, paid her bills on time, and had maintained perfect rental history for 3 years in one of Karen's properties. But then her 7-year-old daughter Emma was diagnosed with leukemia, and everything changed overnight. Medical bills devoured her savings within weeks. She had to cut back work hours to be with Emma during chemotherapy treatments. For the first time in her adult life, Jennifer fell behind on rent by $850. She immediately contacted Karen, provided medical documentation about Emma's cancer, and proposed a reasonable payment plan to catch up within 60 days. She begged for compassion, explained that her daughter was fighting for her life, and promised she would make everything right. Karen's response revealed the depth of her cruelty. She showed zero empathy for the sick child. She refused any payment plan and actually increased Jennifer's rent by $200 as punishment for what she called the inconvenience. Then Karen did something completely illegal that would eventually destroy her entire life. Without providing proper notice, without obtaining a court order, without following any legal eviction procedures, Karen simply changed the locks while Jennifer was at the hospital with Emma. When Jennifer came home that evening, exhausted from watching her daughter receive chemotherapy, she found all of her family's belongings dumped on the street in the rain. Clothes soaked, furniture damaged, her children's toys scattered across the sidewalk like garbage. Karen had committed an illegal eviction, and she didn't care because she assumed Jennifer was too poor and too broken to fight back. Jennifer and her 2 children, 7-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Michael, spent the next 6 weeks living in her 2004 Honda Civic. Emma missed critical chemotherapy appointments because they had no stable address. Michael developed respiratory problems from sleeping in the cold car. Jennifer lost her nursing job because she couldn't maintain employment without stable housing. The security deposit of $1,800 that could have helped them find temporary housing was never returned. Karen claimed property damage that didn't exist, keeping money that legally belonged to a homeless family with a child fighting cancer. Jennifer was desperate, broken, and out of options. She couldn't afford a lawyer for civil court. She had nowhere to turn. That's when someone told her about Judge Judy, and she decided to take one last chance at justice. She had no idea that Judge Judy had been preparing for someone exactly like Karen Westbrook. She had no idea that the judge had spent the night before reviewing Karen's entire rental history, documenting a pattern of illegal evictions, and gathering evidence that would expose Karen as a criminal on national television. Karen thought she was facing another easy victory over a powerless victim. Instead, she was about to encounter the one person in America who had the power and the will to destroy everything she had built on the suffering of vulnerable families. Karen Westbrook wasn't born cruel, but by the time she reached 48 years old, she had transformed into the kind of person who could look at human suffering and see only an opportunity for profit. Her journey to becoming a slumlord who targeted vulnerable families began 15 years earlier when she married Richard Westbrook, a successful investment banker whose income allowed Karen to quit her job as a bank loan officer and focus on what she called building a real estate portfolio. What started as purchasing 2 rental properties quickly evolved into an obsession with accumulating wealth through any means necessary, and Karen discovered that the easiest tenants to exploit were the ones who couldn't fight back. Single mothers working multiple jobs who couldn't take time off to go to court. Immigrants who feared any interaction with the legal system. People with poor credit who had limited housing options and would tolerate almost anything to keep a roof over their families' heads. These became Karen's preferred targets because she understood something that made her particularly dangerous. Desperate people will accept treatment that others would never tolerate, and poverty creates a power imbalance that cruel landlords can weaponize. Karen's method was calculated and refined through years of practice. She would advertise her properties at slightly below market rate to attract applicants who were struggling financially. During the application process, she would ask invasive questions about their employment, their family situation, their support network, and gather information she would later use against them. Once tenants moved in, Karen would begin her campaign of control and intimidation. She conducted surprise inspections, sometimes showing up at 6 a.m. claiming she needed to check for maintenance issues. She kept detailed files on every tenant, noting their work schedules, their visitors, when they left for work, when they came home. This wasn't property management. This was surveillance designed to find vulnerabilities she could exploit. Karen knew which families were living paycheck to paycheck, which tenants had family members who could help them in a crisis, which people were isolated and alone. She gathered this information like a predator studying prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The pattern of abuse was consistent across all 12 of her properties. Karen would wait until a tenant experienced some kind of crisis. A medical emergency, a car breakdown, a temporary job loss, anything that might cause them to be even a few days late on rent. That's when she would pounce with aggressive demands and threats. She would tack on late fees that exceeded legal limits, claim violations of lease terms that didn't actually exist, and threaten immediate eviction for minor issues that other landlords would handle with a simple conversation. If tenants tried to negotiate or asked for reasonable accommodation, Karen interpreted any pushback as defiance that needed to be crushed. She had forced out 23 families over 5 years, and in every single case, she had kept their security deposits by fabricating damage charges. Carpet stains that were there before the tenant moved in suddenly became their responsibility. Normal wear and tear was classified as property damage requiring expensive repairs. She would provide itemized bills for work that was never actually performed, knowing that most tenants couldn't afford to hire lawyers to fight over $1,800 or $2,000 even though that money represented everything to families who were already struggling. What made Karen truly dangerous was her complete lack of empathy combined with an ability to justify her cruelty through twisted logic. She genuinely believed she was teaching people important life lessons about responsibility and consequences. In her mind, poverty was a personal failure, a character flaw that needed to be corrected through harsh treatment. She told her husband Richard that she was actually helping these people by holding them to high standards, claiming that being soft on tenants who struggled would only enable their bad decisions. She viewed herself as a successful businesswoman making tough but necessary choices, completely blind to the reality that she was running an illegal operation built on exploiting human suffering. Her wealth had insulated her from consequences for so long that she had developed a sense of invincibility. The few tenants who had tried to file complaints with housing authorities had been intimidated into dropping their cases. The one tenant who threatened to sue her backed down after Karen's lawyer sent threatening letters about countersuits for property damage. Karen had learned that most vulnerable people couldn't sustain a legal fight against someone with money and resources, and she used that knowledge to operate with complete impunity. Karen's husband Richard had initially supported her real estate investments, but as the years passed and the complaints mounted, he had retreated into willful ignorance. He didn't want to know the details of how Karen managed her properties. He didn't ask questions about the constant turnover of tenants or the frequent angry phone calls their home received. The money from the rental properties funded their comfortable lifestyle, the designer clothes Karen wore, the expensive vacations they took, the country club membership they enjoyed. It was easier for Richard to pretend everything was legitimate business than to confront the reality that his wife had become the kind of landlord that local tenant advocacy groups warned people about. Karen's cruelty had been subsidizing their upper-middle-class lifestyle, and now that exploitation was about to be exposed on national television in front of millions of viewers who would make her the most hated landlord in America. Jennifer Williams had always believed that hard work and responsibility would be enough to build a stable life for her children. She had grown up in foster care, bouncing between 7 different homes before aging out of the system at 18, and she was determined that her own kids would never experience that kind of instability. She put herself through nursing assistant certification while working nights at a diner, saved every penny for a security deposit, and finally found what seemed like the perfect apartment in one of Karen Westbrook's properties 3 years before everything fell apart. The 2-bedroom unit wasn't fancy, but it was clean, affordable, and in a decent school district for her daughter Emma and son Michael. Jennifer signed the lease with genuine excitement, believing she had finally achieved the security she had dreamed about her entire life. For 3 years, everything went exactly according to plan. Jennifer worked double shifts at the hospital, sometimes pulling 16-hour days to make sure rent was always paid on time. She kept the apartment immaculate, never complained about minor maintenance issues, and was exactly the kind of reliable tenant that any reasonable landlord would appreciate. Karen barely acknowledged her existence during those 3 years because Jennifer never gave her an opportunity to manufacture problems or create conflict. Then came the phone call that shattered everything. Emma, who had just turned 7 years old, had been complaining about feeling tired and having pain in her bones. Jennifer assumed it was just growing pains or maybe the flu, but when Emma's symptoms didn't improve after 2 weeks, she took her daughter to the pediatrician. The doctor noticed alarming results in Emma's blood work and immediately referred them to an oncologist at the children's hospital. 3 days later, Jennifer sat in a sterile consultation room and heard words that no parent should ever have to hear. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Aggressive treatment needed immediately. Chemotherapy starting within the week. Her 7-year-old daughter had cancer, and Jennifer's entire world collapsed in the space of a single conversation. The doctor explained the treatment protocol with professional compassion, but all Jennifer could hear was a roaring in her ears as she processed the reality that her baby girl was fighting for her life. The oncologist outlined a treatment plan that would require intense chemotherapy cycles, frequent hospital stays, and constant monitoring. Emma would need her mother by her side through every painful procedure, every bout of nausea, every moment of fear when the treatment made her feel worse than the disease itself. The financial devastation was immediate and catastrophic. Even with her health insurance, the out-of-pocket costs for Emma's cancer treatment were staggering. Copays for specialist visits, expensive medications not fully covered by insurance, the special nutritional supplements Emma needed when chemotherapy destroyed her appetite, the gas money for daily trips to the children's hospital that was 40 minutes away. Jennifer's carefully maintained savings account that had taken 3 years to build was wiped out in less than a month. She had to reduce her work hours because Emma's treatment schedule was unpredictable and demanding. Some days Emma would be too sick from chemotherapy to go to school, and Jennifer couldn't leave her 7-year-old alone while she was vomiting and weak. The hospital's social worker tried to connect Jennifer with assistance programs, but there was a 6-week waiting period for emergency medical financial aid, and rent was due in 5 days. For the first time in her adult life, Jennifer didn't have enough money to pay her bills, and the shame of that reality was almost as painful as watching her daughter suffer through cancer treatment. Jennifer contacted Karen Westbrook the moment she realized she would be short on rent. She called, left voicemails, sent emails, desperately trying to explain the situation and work out a solution before the first of the month arrived. When Karen finally responded 3 days later, her voice was cold and completely devoid of sympathy. Jennifer explained everything through tears, described Emma's cancer diagnosis, offered to provide medical documentation, and proposed a reasonable payment plan where she would catch up on the $850 shortage within 60 days. She had already picked up 2 extra shifts for the following month and had a plan to make everything right. Karen's response was brief and devastating. She didn't care about Emma's cancer. She didn't care about Jennifer's 3 years of perfect rental history. She didn't care about the proposed payment plan. Rent was due on the 1st, and if Jennifer couldn't pay, she needed to find somewhere else to live. Then Karen did something that revealed the true depth of her cruelty. She actually increased Jennifer's rent by $200, claiming it was compensation for the inconvenience and the risk of having an unreliable tenant. Jennifer begged, explained that her daughter was literally fighting cancer, asked for basic human compassion, but Karen had already made her decision. This was an opportunity to force out a tenant and keep the security deposit, and Karen never let compassion interfere with profit. What happened next would haunt Jennifer Williams for the rest of her life and would eventually become the evidence that destroyed Karen Westbrook's entire property empire. On a Tuesday afternoon, Jennifer left the apartment at noon to take Emma to her scheduled chemotherapy appointment at the Children's Hospital. The treatment session lasted 4 hours, and Emma was violently sick afterward, vomiting in the hospital bathroom while Jennifer held her thin, trembling body and whispered reassurances that everything would be okay. By the time they got back to the apartment complex at 6:30 that evening, exhausted and emotionally drained, Jennifer immediately knew something was wrong. Her key wouldn't turn in the lock. She tried again, thinking maybe she was just tired and not inserting it correctly, but the key wouldn't even slide into the mechanism. Karen had changed the locks without warning, without legal notice, without a court order. Jennifer's hands started shaking as the reality of the situation hit her. She ran around to the back door, finding it similarly locked. She peered through the windows and saw that all of their belongings, everything they owned in the world, had been thrown into garbage bags and dumped in a pile in the middle of the living room floor. Jennifer called Karen immediately, her voice rising in panic as she explained that her sick daughter was standing outside in the cold and they couldn't get into their home. Karen's response was delivered with casual cruelty that Jennifer would never forget. She said that Jennifer was no longer a tenant, that her belongings would be placed outside the building, and that if Jennifer didn't remove everything within 24 hours, it would all be taken to the dump. Then Karen hung up while Jennifer was still begging her to reconsider. 30 minutes later, the building maintenance man appeared with a dolly and began carrying garbage bags full of Jennifer's possessions outside, dumping them on the sidewalk without care or consideration. Clothes tumbled out onto the wet pavement. Michael's toy cars scattered across the grass. Emma's stuffed animals landed in puddles. 3 years of carefully maintained home life was reduced to trash bags on a sidewalk while neighbors watched from their windows, some with sympathy, others with the uncomfortable relief that it wasn't happening to them. Jennifer frantically tried to gather what she could, loading bags into her Honda Civic while Emma sat in the front seat crying and asking why the mean lady was throwing away their things. That night, Jennifer, Emma, and 5-year-old Michael slept in the car in a shopping center parking lot, and Jennifer cried silently so her children wouldn't hear her despair. The next 6 weeks were a nightmare that no family should ever have to endure. Jennifer couldn't afford a hotel, couldn't come up with the first month's rent and security deposit for a new apartment, and had nowhere to turn for immediate help. Every social service agency had waiting lists. Emergency housing shelters were full. Her ex-husband had disappeared years ago and provided no child support. She had no family to take them in because she had grown up in foster care and had no relatives she could contact. They lived in that Honda Civic through cold October nights, parking in different locations each evening to avoid being hassled by police or security guards. Jennifer would wake up at 5 in the morning, drive to a gas station bathroom where they could wash up, then take the kids to school pretending everything was normal. Emma missed 3 chemotherapy appointments because Jennifer couldn't provide a stable address for the hospital to send appointment reminders, and the oncology social worker was threatening to report her to Child Protective Services for medical neglect. Michael developed a persistent cough from sleeping in the cold car, and Jennifer spent nights terrified that she was failing both of her children while trying desperately to figure out how to get them back into stable housing. What Jennifer didn't know during those 6 weeks of hell was that Karen Westbrook had done this exact same thing to 18 other families before her. What she didn't know was that someone from her apartment complex had contacted a local tenant advocacy organization, and that organization had been documenting Karen's illegal eviction practices for 2 years. What she didn't know was that the advocate who took her case had connections to Judge Judy's production team and knew exactly how to get her story in front of someone who had the power and platform to deliver real justice. Judge Judy's researchers spent 3 days investigating Karen's rental history before agreeing to hear Jennifer's case, and what they uncovered was so disturbing that Judge Judy herself got personally involved in the preparation. The research team contacted former tenants who had been illegally evicted by Karen and discovered a pattern of predatory behavior that went far beyond simple landlord disputes. They obtained housing authority complaints that had been filed but never properly investigated. They documented code violations at 9 of Karen's 12 properties, finding evidence of mold, faulty electrical wiring, and broken heating systems that Karen ignored while collecting full rent from families who couldn't afford to move. They pulled court records showing that Karen had been sued 4 times by former tenants but had used aggressive legal tactics and expensive lawyers to intimidate people into dropping their cases. Judge Judy Schindler walked into her courtroom that morning with a thick manila folder containing evidence that would completely destroy Karen Westbrook's carefully constructed image as a successful businesswoman. She had presided over 20,000 cases during her 25 years as a family court judge in Manhattan before her television career, and she had developed an almost supernatural ability to identify predators who exploited vulnerable people within seconds of meeting them. Karen Westbrook had triggered every single one of Judge Judy's warning signals during their brief pre-show meeting. The entitled posture, the dismissive way she spoke about her tenants, the complete lack of empathy when Jennifer's situation was mentioned. Judge Judy knew exactly what kind of person she was dealing with, and she had prepared a legal destruction so thorough that Karen would remember this day for the rest of her life. The courtroom was packed with spectators, cameras positioned to capture every moment, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation even though most people in attendance had no idea they were about to witness one of the most satisfying moments of justice in television history. Jennifer Williams entered the courtroom holding Emma's hand, and the visual contrast between the two parties was striking and heartbreaking. Jennifer wore her only professional outfit, a simple black dress that had seen better days, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who had been living in survival mode for months. Emma, pale and thin from chemotherapy, wore a pink hat covering her head where her hair had fallen out, and she clutched a worn stuffed rabbit like it was a lifeline to safety. Karen Westbrook arrived 15 minutes later in a designer pantsuit that probably cost more than Jennifer's monthly rent, her jewelry glittering under the courtroom lights, her expensive leather handbag casually slung over her shoulder. She walked in with the confidence of someone who had never lost a fight against a poor person, someone who genuinely believed that wealth equaled invincibility. Karen glanced at Jennifer and Emma with barely concealed contempt, and that single look told everyone in the courtroom exactly who she was and what she thought of people she considered beneath her. Judge Judy began with the standard opening, asking Jennifer to explain why she had brought this case to court. Jennifer's voice shook as she described the illegal eviction, breaking down as she explained coming home from Emma's chemotherapy appointment to find the locks changed and their belongings dumped on the street. She described 6 weeks of homelessness, of her children sleeping in a car, of Emma missing critical cancer treatments because they had no stable address. Tears streamed down Jennifer's face as she explained that all she wanted was her $1,800 security deposit returned so she could try to find stable housing for her sick daughter. Emma started crying during her mother's testimony, the 7-year-old clearly traumatized by the memory of those terrible weeks, and the sound of that child's sobs filled the courtroom with the kind of pain that should have moved any human being with a functioning conscience. The audience members were visibly emotional, several people wiping tears from their eyes, and even the court stenographer paused for a moment to compose herself as Jennifer described holding her vomiting daughter in a gas station bathroom because they had nowhere else to go. That's when Karen Westbrook did something so callous, so shockingly cruel, that it would define her forever in the minds of millions of viewers. She actually laughed. Not a quiet chuckle or nervous giggle, but a full, dismissive laugh that echoed through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. Judge Judy's head snapped toward Karen with an expression of pure disbelief, but Karen either didn't notice or didn't care about the fury building in front of her. Karen rolled her eyes dramatically and addressed Judge Judy with the kind of condescending tone reserved for explaining simple concepts to stupid people. "Your Honor," she began, her voice dripping with fake sophistication and genuine contempt, "this is just another sob story from someone who can't manage their finances properly. These people always have excuses. Medical bills, sick kids, job problems, it's always something with these types." She actually made air quotes around the word types, making it abundantly clear she was referring to poor people as a category of humans beneath her consideration. Karen continued her monologue, seemingly oblivious to the horrified reactions from everyone else in the courtroom. She claimed that Jennifer had been a problematic tenant who violated the lease agreement by not paying rent on time, conveniently ignoring the 3 years of perfect payment history that preceded Emma's cancer diagnosis. Karen turned slightly toward the audience as if she expected them to appreciate her business acumen and said something that would become the most replayed clip of the entire case. Maybe if she made better life choices, she wouldn't be homeless. The courtroom went completely silent except for Emma's quiet crying. Karen looked directly at the 6-7-year-old child and continued with even more shocking cruelty, saying, "Oh please, spare us the theatrics, everyone has problems, my property isn't a charity for people who can't pay their bills." Then came the line that sealed Karen's fate forever. She actually smiled as she said maybe homelessness will teach her some responsibility about managing money properly. The silence that followed Karen's mocking statement was the kind of silence that precedes volcanic eruptions. Judge Judy sat perfectly still in her chair, her hands folded on the bench in front of her, but everyone who had watched her show for years recognized that posture. It was the calm before an absolute storm of judicial fury. Her eyes had transformed from their usual sharp attentiveness into something far more dangerous, a cold rage that promised complete and utter destruction. Karen Westbrook, incredibly, seemed to interpret Judge Judy's silence as agreement or perhaps indifference, and she actually leaned back in her chair with a satisfied smirk, believing she had successfully established herself as the reasonable party in this dispute. She had no idea that she had just committed professional suicide on national television, and that the next 5 minutes would destroy everything she had built through years of exploiting vulnerable families. Judge Judy began speaking in that deceptively calm voice that regular viewers knew meant someone was about to be absolutely annihilated. "Miss Westbrook," she said, "let me make sure I understand your testimony correctly. You believe that homelessness teaches responsibility. You believe that a mother whose 7-year-old daughter has cancer deserves to sleep in a car because she fell behind on rent by $850 for the first time in 3 years. You believe that dumping a family's belongings on the street without legal notice, without a court order, without following any proper eviction procedures, is acceptable landlord behavior. Is that an accurate summary of your position?" Karen, still not understanding the danger she was in, actually nodded and said, "Yes, Your Honor, that's exactly right. I have to protect my property and my business interests." The words were barely out of her mouth before Judge Judy opened the thick manila folder that had been sitting in front of her throughout the entire hearing. "Miss Westbrook," Judge Judy continued, her voice beginning to rise with controlled fury, "let me educate you about what real landlord responsibilities look like, because clearly you've spent years operating under the delusion that property ownership gives you the right to violate the law. What you did to Miss Williams wasn't an eviction, it was an illegal lockout, which in the state of Connecticut is a criminal offense punishable by fines and potential jail time. You changed locks without providing written notice, without obtaining a court order, without following any legal procedure whatsoever. You literally confessed to committing a crime on national television." Karen's face began to change as the reality of her situation started to penetrate her arrogance. Her smirk faltered, replaced by confusion and the first hints of genuine fear. But Judge Judy was just getting started, and she had evidence that would expose Karen as far worse than just an ignorant landlord who didn't understand proper procedures. Judge Judy held up document after document from the folder, each one representing another piece of Karen's criminal enterprise. "Let's talk about your other properties, shall we?" she said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a razor. "You own 12 rental units across Connecticut, and I have documentation here showing that you've illegally evicted 23 families in the past 5 years using the exact same tactic you used on Miss Williams. 19 of those 23 families were single mothers, which suggests you specifically target vulnerable women who you believe can't fight back. In every single case, you kept their security deposits by fabricating damage charges for wear and tear that is legally considered normal. That's not business, Miss Westbrook, that's fraud. It's theft. It's a pattern of criminal behavior that you've been getting away with because your victims were too poor to hire lawyers to hold you accountable." Karen tried to interrupt, her voice rising in panic as she stammered that those were different situations, that Judge Judy didn't understand the full context, but Judge Judy cut her off with devastating precision. "I'm not finished, Miss Westbrook," Judge Judy declared, her voice now filled with righteous fury. 9 of your 12 properties have active housing code violations that you've ignored while collecting full rent from families who can't afford to move. Mold in bathrooms that you refuse to remediate. Faulty electrical wiring that poses fire hazards. Broken heating systems that leave tenants freezing through winter months. You're not a businesswoman, you're a slumlord who preys on people in crisis. And then you had the audacity, the unbelievable arrogance, to sit in my courtroom and mock a homeless mother with a child who has cancer. You laughed at her suffering. You told her that homelessness would teach her responsibility. You looked at a 7-year-old girl who was fighting for her life and dismissed her pain as theatrics. The courtroom was completely silent except for Judge Judy's voice, and Karen Westbrook's face had gone from confident to pale to absolutely ashen as the magnitude of her exposure sank in. Every illegal action, every cruel decision, every family she had destroyed was being laid out in front of millions of television viewers, and there was no way to spin this, no way to recover from this level of public humiliation and legal exposure. Judge Judy delivered her ruling with the finality of a guillotine blade. "Miss Westbrook, I am ordering you to pay Miss Williams $1,800 for the security deposit you illegally kept, $10,000 in damages for the illegal eviction, $5,000 for emotional distress caused by forcing a family with a sick child into homelessness, and $3,000 for lost wages when Miss Williams lost her nursing job due to the housing instability you created. Total judgment of $19,800, to be paid before you leave this courthouse today." The audience erupted in applause, but Judge Judy wasn't done. "I am also forwarding all evidence of your illegal evictions to the Connecticut Housing Authority for investigation, and I'm sending documentation to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal fraud charges. Every single one of your properties will be inspected, and I sincerely hope you lose your rental license and are never allowed to terrorize another vulnerable family again." Karen Westbrook's complete breakdown was instant and absolute. She shot up from her chair, her voice climbing to hysterical levels as she screamed that this wasn't fair, that Judge Judy couldn't do this to her, that she had expenses and mortgages and couldn't afford to pay $19,000. The irony of a wealthy landlord claiming she couldn't afford to pay was lost on no one, and Judge Judy's response was ice cold. "You couldn't afford it? Interesting. Miss Williams couldn't afford to be homeless either, but that didn't stop you from throwing her family onto the street. Figure it out, Miss Westbrook. You have until 5 p.m. today or you'll be held in contempt." Karen dissolved into tears, her designer makeup running down her face in black streaks, her expensive handbag falling to the floor as she clutched the defendant's table for support. The woman who had mocked a cancer patient and laughed at homelessness was now sobbing uncontrollably, begging for financial mercy she had never shown to anyone else. The aftermath was swift and devastating. The video went viral within hours, racking up 42 million views in the first week alone. The hashtag Justice for Jennifer trended worldwide as people shared the clip of Karen's mocking laugh followed by her complete destruction. Connecticut housing authorities launched a full investigation that found violations at every single one of Karen's properties, resulting in $85,000 in mandatory repairs and the condemnation of 3 units. She lost her rental license, faced criminal fraud charges, and the 23 families she had previously evicted filed a class action lawsuit that ultimately cost her $340,000 in restitution. Her property empire collapsed completely, and she became the most hated landlord in America overnight. Jennifer Williams received her full payment that same day, and viewers who were moved by her story started a fundraiser that raised over $127,000 for Emma's medical bills. Jennifer found stable housing, got her nursing job back, and Emma's cancer went into full remission. 1 year later, the family was thriving, and Jennifer had been elected to her local tenant advocacy board where she worked to protect other families from landlords like Karen Westbrook. This case became more than just a viral moment. It sparked real change. Connecticut passed legislation strengthening penalties for illegal evictions, landlord associations across the country implemented mandatory ethics training, and tenant rights organizations used the footage to educate renters about their legal protections. Judge Judy had delivered more than a judgment that day. She had exposed a predator, given a voice to the voiceless, and reminded millions of viewers that wealth doesn't protect you from accountability when you face someone who genuinely cares about justice. Karen Westbrook learned the hardest lesson of her life. That cruelty has consequences, that mocking the vulnerable makes you the villain, and that sometimes karma arrives in the form of a 78-year-old judge who refuses to let bullies win. If you believe Judge Judy delivered exactly the justice that Karen deserved, smash that like button right now. Comment justice served if you think more landlords who exploit vulnerable families need to be held accountable like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell because we're bringing you more stories of entitled people getting the reality check they desperately need. Share this video with anyone who needs to see that bullies don't always win, and that sometimes the system actually works when the right person is in charge. The battle against people who abuse power is far from over, and you won't want to miss the next case where karma catches up with someone who thought they were untouchable.